I used to be of the mindset that life is too short to reread books. After all, there's millions and millions of books that have been written out there, and even if you were to read a book every single day of your life, you wouldn't even scratch the surface of everything that's out there. So, with that much to read, why would you ever reread a book? At least that's the way I used to think. I've changed my mind about that. And so this year in 2026, I'm kind of calling this my year of rereading. My goal is to revisit some of my favorite books of the past and see why I love them or see if I still love them. And in this video, I want to talk about why maybe you might want to consider rereading things as well. And I'm going to do it through the lens of Haruki Murakami's Kafka on the Shore. So the way this video is going to be structured is I'll start and I'll talk a little bit about my experience with Kafka on the Shore, and then I'll go through 4 reasons why I think rereading is a good idea, and then I'll end the video with a few tips of how you might want to go about rereading if it's something that is interesting to you. If that sounds good to you, let's jump into it. Before I talk about rereading, I want to talk a little bit about Kafka on the Shore specifically because it's the book that I'm going to be explaining these concepts through because I just reread it, and also because this was one of my favorite novels of all time. Kafka on the Shore was published in Japan in 2002, and if I'm not mistaken, it was translated in 2005, and so I probably read this book late 2005, sometime in 2006. And to give you a sense of where I was personally at that point, I was at the end of my law school journey. I had gone through this lull in terms of reading, where after 3.5 years of law school, all I'd been reading was case law and legal texts and legal theory, and I hadn't really read any fiction for a long time. And Kafka on the Shore was kind of the first novel that I read getting me back into fiction, especially literary fiction. And for that reason, it holds a very special place in my heart because it brought me back to the love of reading that I had before I got bogged down in reading thousands upon thousands of pages of legal texts every single week. But it gives you an idea of kind of the place that this book holds in my mind. And I haven't read this book since 2005, 2006, up until very, very recently. So that's almost 20 years between when I first read the book and today. And so now we're going to go through some of the reasons why I think it's worthwhile to reread, specifically talking about it through the lens of Kafka on the Shore. So the first reason I think you might want to reread is because when you reread a book, you're coming at it as a different person. You have more experience as a reader, you have more lived experience, you have more life experience. And so as you go into the book, you are bringing a whole different set of experiences to that second reading that were not there in the first reading. And because at its best, reading a book, especially fiction, is a conversation with the author, if you're a different person the second time you have that conversation, the conversation itself is actually going to be different. So the experience of reading the book the second time is going to be a whole different experience. What does that mean? Well, this works particularly well for an author like Murakami, where his books aren't so much about the plot. If you've never read a Murakami novel, then that might not make a whole lot of sense to you. But especially Kafka on the Shore, if I were to try and summarize the plot of this novel to you, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. In fact, if you read the novel, by the time you get to the end, you still won't think it has made a ton of sense. But the way Murakami writes, the idea is you are supposed to make of the story what you will. You bring your own interpretation to it. And so the first time I read this, I was in my early 20s. I had a certain amount of education behind me. I'd read a certain number of books, but I was by no means the mature reader that I still probably am not, but I'm getting closer to being today. And so the first time I read this book, there were definitely elements in it that went completely over my head. And so if you take a look at Kafka on the Shore, you've got a book that has themes of identity, of battling your ego, of the individual versus society. A lot of different things are packed into this 400-page novel. And the first time I read this book, honestly, the thing that I loved the most about it was the way it made me feel. It wasn't an intellectual appreciation for Murakami, it was really an emotional resonance. And when you're a person like me who has a tendency to overthink things, when you read a book that makes you feel a certain way, that can make you feel a certain emotional state, those things tend to stick with you. And so Kafka on the Shore, for the last 20 years or so, has always stayed in the back of my mind as this book that makes me feel a certain way, and it's the reason why I keep coming back to Murakami as an author. You could say that originally I loved Murakami for the vibes. Now that being said, fast forward 20 years, and now when I read this novel, I notice there's a bunch of things in here that I just didn't see the first time around. So for instance, It's impossible to read this novel and not realize that it's about identity. But for example, the entire idea of the theme around society and how characters can represent entire nations, the ideas of Japanese culture, all of those things were completely lost on me. To get specific, you can take a look at the character of Nakata. And at one point in my life, I would have read that and seen this is the type of life that you can have if you are unencumbered by sort of caring about society's rules or being or over intellectualizing things or not trying to ascribe too much meaning to your life. But the whole idea of Nakata being a character that represents culturally post-war Japan and this idea of forgotten memory is something that never would have occurred to me if I didn't have an additional decade plus of experience where I've learned about Japan, where I've learned more about society. So those are things that just I wouldn't have seen before. Also, there's a scene in the book where you've got a battle between Crow and Johnny Walker. Again, if you've never read the book, these things sound absurd, and they kind of are, and that's kind of the point of the book. But through this battle, if you're reading this as a younger reader, as I did, you might not fully understand what's going on here, but if you come to it with a little bit more experience, having read a few more pieces of literary fiction, you might start to see some connections here. So Crow, for instance, can be this idea of the individual, the self-expression, battling up against the never-changing, never-moving society or bureaucracy that is Johnny Walker. And if you overlay the lens of the fact that Murakami is a Japanese author and is writing from the perspective of someone who grew up in post-war Japan, that gives you a whole other flavor to appreciate this book from, something that I didn't appreciate 20 years ago, even though 20 years ago, this was still a book that I really, really did tremendously enjoy. This book is packed full of mythical references. Now, obviously, the obvious one here is the connection to Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, and this idea of the prophecy that someone will kill their father, sleep with their mother. That part is blatantly obvious within the book, but there are so many other mythical references within this book that because I had not read nearly enough mythology 20 years ago, I just didn't see. So just to take one example, the idea of the flute. There's a character who plays a flute. What is the meaning of that flute? Why are flutes even important? Well, pull that back to mythology and you can think of Orpheus and the importance the flute has in him and sort of crossing that barrier between the living and the dead, and so crossing boundaries. You could think of things like Pan's flute and how that allows someone to connect with a greater nature. So all of these influences, all of this mythology, stuff that, again, first time I read this book, didn't even see. And so the second time I came back to Kafka on the Shore, I was basically reading a completely different novel because I was seeing all these things that just were not there the first time. The second reason to reread is that not only do you as a person change, but also, especially in the case of an author that you have read much more of, your knowledge of that author changes, and you can also see how that author has evolved. So Kafka on the Shore, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this was published originally in 2002. English version came out in 2005. And then I have this other novel by Murakami called Killing Commendatore, which was published in English in 2018. I'm not sure what the Japanese publication date was, but it probably was pretty close to 2018 as well. So there's about 15, 16 years that are separating these two novels. But having read both of them, it is really hard not to see the parallels between them. In a lot of ways, Killing Commendatore feels like a revisiting of Kafka on the Shore. So many of the same themes are being repeated. Now, Murakami is infamous for repeating a lot of the same themes across his different novels, but in this case, it almost feels like if you were to write a sequel to Kafka on the Shore with different characters but exploring the same ideas, you would end up with Killing Commendatore. You have a protagonist who is escaping an urban life into a much smaller, call it rural or suburban life. You have this idea of a lost love, whether that be a mother or whether that be a wife. You have this idea of crossing over into different worlds, crossing through boundaries. And then the one that is most striking is this idea of the personification of concepts. In both Kafka on the Shore and in Killing Commendatore, this idea of concepts coming to life as these sort of conceptual, metaphorical characters, but that the main character actually interacts with is highly present. Now, Killing Commendatore, again, because it was written considerably later than Kafka on the Shore, kind of feels like the more polished version of Kafka on the Shore. Murakami's a more mature writer. He's coming at it from a more mature lens. Even your protagonist is about 20 years older in Killing Commendatore. And so it really does feel like this is Murakami coming back to the themes that he explored as a younger author and saying, now that I have all of this experience behind me, how can I approach this with all of the additional skill that I have? That being said, between these two novels, bizarrely enough, I actually still prefer Kafka on the Shore because it feels more raw. It feels less polished. It feels more emotionally charged than Killing Commendatore does. Killing Commendatore, I think, technically is the stronger book, but I think from an emotional perspective, Kafka on the Shore hits harder. All this to say, none of this is stuff that I would have noticed if I had not gone back and reread Kafka on the Shore. Reading Killing Commendatore 15 years after I read Kafka on the Shore was too big of a distance for me to realize the parallels between the two novels and to really understand what Murakami was trying to do, re-exploring these same themes. But by reading Kafka, then reading Commendatore, and then coming back to Kafka, I got to see this picture across both novels that was just enjoyable in a completely different way and actually elevated both novels in my eyes. The third reason to revisit novels is that in the time that elapses between your first and second reading, the social context might change. So when I read Murakami in the mid-aughts, I was completely unaware of any controversy around him as an author. And if you aren't aware of that controversy either, a quick Google search will catch you up really quickly. But it's really hard to not take the social context into account when you are reading these different works. So the social context in the mid 2000s was very different from the social context in the mid 2020s. The idea of wokeness did not exist, at least as a word itself. That wasn't a thing. The Black Lives Matter movement had not yet happened. A lot of social justice progress or pendulum swings in terms of, movement from left to right, a lot of that stuff had not yet occurred. And so reading the book at that time, you're reading it through a different lens. When you come back to that book 20 years later, it gives you a whole other view of the way you should be interpreting certain passages. And there's a specific passage in this book that I marked out because I feel like when you read this and you understand that this was written 20 plus years ago, and you put it in the context of what you know has happened over the course of the last 20 years, it really changes the way you feel about this. So I'm going to read a little passage here, and I'll put it up on the screen so you can follow along. And again, this is not me trying to make a value judgment about this, but it is really hard to read this and not go, wow, this hits really differently in today's social context versus what I read it in when I first read this book. All right, so this is the character Oshima, who is talking to Kafka about sort of his stance on how he sees people who are, what we would call today social justice warriors. Now, to put it in context, Oshima is a born female, identifies as male, and describes himself as a homosexual. And so he prefers the company of men. He has female physical parts, but he has his sexual preferences still geared towards men, even though he identifies as a man. So he identifies as a homosexual male despite having female physiology. So here's what Oshima is saying at this point. He says, narrow minds devoid of imagination, intolerance, theories cut off from reality, empty terminology, usurped ideals, inflexible systems. Those are the things that really frighten me. What I absolutely fear and loathe. Of course, it's important to know what's right and what's wrong. Individual errors in judgment can usually be corrected. As long as you have the courage to admit mistakes, things can be turned around. But intolerant, narrow minds with no imagination are like parasites that transform the host, change form, and continue to thrive. They're a lost cause, and I don't want anyone like that coming in here. A Japanese author wrote those words 20 plus years ago in a context where this wasn't even a conversation that we were having in the zeitgeist. It makes you think a little bit, and it changes your sort of perception and your lens of how you read some of the other stuff that you read by that author or things that are written about that author. Okay, that brings me to the fourth reason why you might want to reread a book. So the first reason I gave was that as a person, you change. But when I said that, what I meant was more your knowledge increases. And so the breadth of things that you can draw on to make connections to increases. So your intellectual capacity as you age grows. And so the way you appreciate a novel changes. Now, what I'm referring to when I say you change as a person is more your individual identity is going to change. And so, what you identify with in the book is going to change. When I originally read Kafka on the Shore in my early 20s, uh, I identified with the character of Kafka Tamura, the main protagonist, who is a 15-year-old boy in this book. But of all the characters in the book, he's the one that really spoke to me the most. And it shouldn't be a surprise as someone who was at the end of school, not knowing where I was going in life, trying to find my place, feeling very lost, feeling like the path that I'd put myself on was the wrong one, that I would identify with a character who himself is completely lost, is literally displacing himself to try and find himself. Rereading this book now as someone in my 40s, I would say of all the characters in this book, Kafka is probably the one I identify with the least. I would identify more with Hoshino, with Miss Saiki, even with Nakata. I would identify with all of those characters before I would identify with Kafka, because the things that are important in my life and the concepts that I'm dealing with and the struggles that I have are completely different today than they were 20 years ago. And so when you identify with different characters, it allows you to appreciate them more and allows you to take new parts of the book out that you didn't see before. So one of the things I find a little bit funny about Kafka on the Shore is that there's multiple points in the book where Murakami, through the voice of his characters, will go out of his way to say that certain things are metaphors. Uh, I don't think I've ever read any other piece of literary fiction that will explicitly tell you this is a metaphor. And you would think for the types of readers who read Murakami, they wouldn't need to be told that something is a metaphor. But alas, Murakami does it all the same. The reason he goes out of his way to do this is to say that you shouldn't be reading this text literally. In fact, you should be bringing your own interpretation to these ideas and these concepts. And so different people reading the same text can take different meanings from this. What that means is, depending on where you are in your life, you could read Kafka on the Shore as a book about potentially finding meaning or finding one's identity. Or you could read it as a book about whether or not meaning even matters, if we need purpose in order to be satisfied. Or you could read it as a book about an individual's place in society, or how an individual interacts with the broader society, or the conflict between individualism and collectivism. All of these are different possible readings of this book, and depending on where you are in your life, a different one is going to strike you for sure. So now that I've given you my reasons for why I think you should reread books, now I'm going to give you a few tips for how to go about doing this and things that'll make the process maybe a little bit more enjoyable or maybe a little bit easier. So here's 4 quick tips on how to go about reading books. The first is, when you are rereading, or even when you're doing a first read of a book, I really think that any good reading should be done with a pencil in hand. Now, I was raised in a household that said books were sacred and you never mark up a book. And so it took me a really long time to get over this idea that books should be marked up. The way I tricked my mind into being able to do this is I only mark up books in pencil, because in the back of my mind, I say to myself, well, you know what? If ever I need to sell the book or give away the book, or someone else wants the book, I could always erase all my notes, erase all my marginalia. The fact of the matter is, in 20 years of writing on books, I don't think I've ever erased anything. And yet the habit of doing this with a pencil has stuck with me to this day. The reason why taking notes in the book itself is really fun, as opposed to taking notes separately, is because if you read the book the first time and you take notes, when you go back to the book the second time, you'll be able to not just reread the book, but also reread your notes and see how you felt about it. Now, unfortunately, as you can probably tell from this copy of Kafka on the Shore, this is not the original version that I read 20 years ago. I think the version that I read was either lent to me by someone, or I lent it to someone else and I no longer have it. I had to go out and buy this book because I wanted it on my bookshelf. But as a result, I didn't have the marginalia from the first time I read the book. And yet now that I have reread it, there are notes in the margin. You can see that maybe a little bit, but probably not very well, because it's in pencil and you can't see it very well. But I will mark up all of my books, because when I go back and look at them next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I will be able to see, here's what I was thinking at the time. And I really kind of wish I had the original edition of Kafka on the Shore that I had originally read, and I really wish I kind of had taken my notes at the time, because it'd be really fun for me to see what 21, 22-year-old Adam thought about this book at the time. The next tip I would have is, as you are rereading a book, constantly be asking yourself a question, or asking yourself several questions about why things feel different on the reread. Ask yourself, is this different because I'm different as a person? Is this different because I'm a better reader? Are there things that just you couldn't possibly have seen until you've read through the book once? This is a lot harder with a book that you're reading 20 years later, but there are definitely books out there where there are clues sprinkled throughout the books that don't become obvious until you go back and reread them. This is definitely true in genre fiction for sure, but even in literary fiction, you will see plenty of pieces of foreshadowing that you will have missed unless you go back and reread the book. And it kind of gives you a whole new experience and appreciation, right? So as you're reading, constantly ask yourself, why is it that this feels different? Maybe you just missed things the first time around, but asking yourself those questions will help you appreciate the reread that much more. Okay, tip number 3. As you reread a book, challenge your appreciation. Now, chances are you're probably not rereading books that you hated the first time around, although maybe you're trying to give a book a second chance. But chances are you're probably rereading books that you enjoyed. At least, that's what I'm doing this year. I'm going back through my favorite books of all time and I'm rereading them to see if I still feel the same way about them. And there's a really good chance that as you do this, if you're being honest with yourself, you will find that there are certain things that resonated with you at one point in your life that just don't feel the same way anymore. I'll give you guys a concrete example. Ernest Hemingway at one point was probably my favorite author. I read everything he had ever written. I just really enjoyed sort of the raw punchiness of his prose, the sort of direct, minimalist approach to the way he wrote. Over time, maybe as I read more authors, maybe as I sort of expanded my literary horizons, I kind of fell out of love with that style a little bit. And so my favorite Hemingway books that I read years ago no longer have the same appeal to me now that they did that. I still like a lot of the stuff Hemingway has written, but there's other stuff that Hemingway has written that I just really don't care for at all. I particularly like his short stories. I think those are beautifully done, but some of his novels just I don't particularly feel strongly about anymore, and it's because I, as a reader, have changed and what I like has changed. And so when you're rereading, challenge your appreciation. Maybe there's things that you used to love that you don't love anymore, and that's okay. Maybe there's things that you didn't appreciate the first time around that on a reread, all of a sudden you see the genius of them. This can be particularly true of things that you were forced to read in school. I can specifically think of a ton of people I know who were forced to read Shakespeare in school and had a dreadful experience with it. And then coming back to Shakespeare as adults, bringing a whole new, fresh perspective, and also just not being forced to read something, they develop a whole new appreciation for Shakespeare. And so challenge how you felt about that book the first time. And then my last tip is, based on what you just read, ask yourself, how does this change how you feel about other things that you've read? So I've already given this example in this video, but rereading Kafka on the Shore changed my appreciation for Killing Commendatory. I almost feel like Killing Commendatory is a book that was written by a man who was revisiting ideas and felt that he had a better grasp on them and wanted to communicate that. And I almost feel like it is better to be read by someone who's read the original book recently so that they can appreciate that evolution in thought. And so reading this book made me appreciate this book more. That might not always be the case. Maybe you'll reread a book and it'll make you appreciate another book less because all of a sudden that other book you'll start to feel like, wait a second, this is just a poor copy, or it feels derivative or something like that. But ask yourself how what you just reread influences how you appreciate other things, either by the same author or within the same genre, or that are connected in some way or other. And that's all I got. So that is my take on why I think you should reread novels, even if life is short, even if you are never going to get time to read every book out there. I mean, part of this is, the same argument for why not to reread applies to why you should read, right? You're never going to be able to read more than 0.0001% of all the books out there anyway. So you might as well find those ones that you really love and go deep in them. Instead of going broad, go deep. That's kind of the theme of my year, I guess, is go deep instead of go broad. I'm reading a lot fewer books. I'm trying to really dig deeper into the ones that I am reading. And one of the ways to go deep is to reread. So if it's something that you have tried before, if you're a serial rereader, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me a note in the comments. Tell me what works for you. If you refuse to reread books, tell me why. Tell me what is it about rereading that just doesn't appeal to you. And if you have any other tips for how to approach rereading a book, I'd also love to hear about that. So drop that note in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.